It's been quite a sequence of events lately, hasn't it?
It really has.
That attack in Pahalgam back on April 22nd,
Hmm.
26 civilians
Yeah.
killed.
Yeah.
I mean, that number alone, it makes
Cool.
it the deadliest attack since, what, 2008 in Mumbai.
That's right. It's a really sobering statistic, puts things in perspective.
Absolutely. And the immediate reaction, the fallout, was pretty swift.
It was. India moved fast, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, closing the border, uh, diplomats expelled, visas canceled, the whole suite of measures.
Well, Pakistan, on their side, denied involvement, called for an investigation.
Exactly. Standard playbook, perhaps, but denials were firm.
Then, just a couple of weeks go by, and boom,
Yep.
Operation Sindoor, May 7th.
Right.
And this wasn't just, diplomatic posturing. This was direct military action. A 23-minute strike,
Mm-hmm.
9 locations hit. And what really stood out to me was, well, the targets weren't just in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Some were actually inside Pakistan's Punjab province.
That's a key point. That does feel like a significant escalation or shift in targeting.
And the hardware they used.
Yeah.
Rafale jets, SLP missiles.
Yeah, the weaponry tells a story, too. Scallion P missiles are, long range. Air-launched cruise missiles, they can hit targets deep inside territory.
Say a signal.
A very clear signal, I'd say. Combined with the AASM hammer bombs, those precision-guided munitions, and the Sky Striker loitering ammunition, it suggests a very specific, very calculated operation.
Targeting specific groups.
The reports indicate Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba camps. Locations like Bahawalpur, Muridke, those were mentioned specifically.
Okay, so India sends its message, but then almost immediately, the stories about what actually happened, they just diverge completely.
Wildly, yes. India claimed, I think, over 100 terrorists eliminated.
Right. But Pakistan?
Pakistan reported much, much lower figures, 31 deaths, 46 injured. And interestingly, they specifically mentioned that relatives of Masood Azhar were among the casualties.
And that divergence, that immediate conflict in narratives, that's where the risk just skyrockets, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, because the very next day, May 8th, Pakistan hit back. Retaliation.
Targeting Indian military bases.
Yes, and across a pretty wide geographical spread. Jammu and Kashmir, Punjab, Gujarat, even Rajasthan reportedly saw attacks.
And India's response to that?
Activation of the S-400 system, their advanced air defense, which, signals they perceived a very serious threat. India claimed it intercepted everything incoming.
Wasn't just ground-to-ground either, was it? There were reports about drones.
That's right. Reports suggested India used Israeli Harpy drones. Those are anti-radiation drones designed to take out air defense radar.
Targeting Pakistani radar sites near Lahore, was it?
Allegedly, yes. And then Pakistan claimed they shot down Indian drones over Karachi and Lahore, and later more loitering munitions. India did confirm losing at least one drone.
And then missiles targeting Jammu,
Yeah.
the airport, the university.
Reportedly intercepted, again, according to Indian claims. But we also heard about explosions, drone sightings, fighter jets near Jammu, Jaisalmer, a lot of activity.
Understandably, the international community got very worried at this point.
Yes, lots of calls for de-escalation, offers to mediate pouring in from different countries.
But it didn't seem to calm things down immediately. By May 9th, things seemed even hotter.
They did. Reports came of more coordinated drone and missile attacks by Pakistan, again targeting Indian military sites like Jammu and Pathankot.
And India's response? Neutralize threats again.
That was the claim, yes. Neutralized all threats.
And then we had that, well, quite extraordinary press conference from Pakistan's Colonel Qureshi.
Yes, alleging this huge drone assault, claiming 300 to 400 Turkish drones were used.
Targeting, what, 36 towns and cities across multiple states?
Across J&K, Rajasthan, Punjab. If those numbers are even close to accurate, that represents a massive escalation, a whole new dimension to the conflict.
So, okay, that's the chaotic backdrop. Intense, rapidly evolving. We wanted to sort of step back from the immediate headlines for this deep dive.
Wait, look at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And we found this JM Financial report that looks at how past conflicts have actually impacted the Indian stock market, the economy, especially thinking about it now after Operation Sindoor.
Trying to get some perspective beyond the day-to-day noise.
Precisely. What might the longer-term effects be? So let's dig into that. What does the report suggest about this Operation Sindoor in terms of strategy?
Well, one of the key takeaways is how it might be redefining deterrence. For a long time, Pakistan's strategy seemed to rely on the nuclear threat, the idea that any big conventional move by India could risk nuclear war, so India wouldn't do it.
Right, the nuclear overhang kind of kept things in check, supposedly.
Supposedly. But Operation Sindoor seems to challenge that head-on. It suggests India is now more willing to conduct these direct military strikes in response to terrorism, despite that nuclear backdrop.
So is it like setting a new kind of red line, a new tripwire, as the report puts it?
That seems to be the interpretation. The idea that certain kinds of attacks, if linked back to Pakistan-based groups, will now almost automatically trigger a calibrated military response from India.
Which puts the onus back on Pakistan, then, to manage the escalation.
It shifts the responsibility, yes. It basically says, if this happens, this is our response. The next move, the escalation, is up to you.
Does this also mean India is less likely to wait for, say, international consensus or mediation before acting?
That could be part of it. You could interpret this as, well, perhaps some frustration with how effective diplomacy has been in the past, maybe a greater willingness now to act unilaterally, or at least more swiftly, when they feel threatened.
But acting swiftly, unilaterally, that comes with risks too, right? Less room for diplomacy.
Absolutely. It potentially closes off diplomatic channels, or at least reduces the time for them to work. And it definitely increases the risk of miscalculation on both sides. That's a major concern.
Which brings us to perhaps the scariest part, the increased risk of this becoming a wider conflict.
Yes. The speed of escalation we just talked about, strikes, counterstrikes, missiles, drones, artillery, it's intense. The report stresses this is the most serious conflict in decades.
Decades.
And that inherently raises the chances of it dragging on, becoming prolonged, or even spilling over into a wider confrontation. And in this kind of charged atmosphere,
Mistakes happen.
Miscalculations become more likely, and tragically, the risk to civilians goes way up.
Okay, so the geopolitical risks are clear and worrying. But let's shift to the economic side, using that JM financial report. How have these kinds of events historically hit the Indian stock market?
This is where it gets quite interesting, maybe even counterintuitive. The report looked back at several past conflicts.
Like Kargil, the parliament attack.
Exactly. Kargil, Parliament attack, 2611 Mumbai attacks. Even more recent things like Uri, Pulwama, and the initial reaction to Pahalgam and Sindoor. And the finding is, generally, the downside for the Indian equity markets has been pretty limited.
Limited? Really?
Yeah. Usually the Nifty index movements, both right after the event and over the duration, tended to stay within, say, a 3–4% range on the downside, sometimes even positive.
Positive. Like during Kargil. Didn't the market actually go up then?
It did. Exhibit 1 in the report shows this clearly. Kargil War, 1999. Nifty was up 7% within just 3 days, and by the end of the conflict period they tracked, it was up a massive 35.6%.
Wow. Okay, that's one example. What about others? Parliament attack. That must have hit harder.
You'd think so, but the Nifty was only down about 1.8% in the first 3 days and finished down about 4% overall for that crisis period.
Still relatively contained.
Yeah.
And 2006-11, the Mumbai attacks.
Nifty was actually up 3.8% within 3 days and basically stayed there by the end of the period tracked. Same pattern for Uri, Pulwama, even the initial market blips for Pahalgam and Sindoor were small.
So the market seems almost resilient. It kind of shrugs off this geopolitical instability. Why would that be?
Well, the report suggests a few potential reasons. Often these conflicts have been seen by the market as geographically limited, relatively short-lived.
Okay.
Plus, the underlying fundamentals, the growth drivers of the Indian economy, often remain strong despite the conflict. Global factors like liquidity and general sentiment towards emerging markets also play a part.
But I guess past performance isn't a guarantee, right? Especially now.
Exactly. That's a crucial caveat. The nature of this current conflict, the potential scale, it could be different. You can't just assume history will repeat perfectly.
Okay, so the market reaction historically seems somewhat muted. What about the impact on the real economy? On GDP growth?
Now that's where the historical data shows a more significant impact. Exhibit 3 in the report lays this out.
So worse than the market reaction?
Generally, yes. For example, the Indochina War in 1962 coincided with a GDP decline of about 0.8%.
Okay.
The 1965 Indo-Pak War saw a bigger hit. GDP actually fell by 2.6%, and that was after a year of pretty strong growth, around 7.5%, so a sharp reversal.
And 1971, the Bangladesh Liberation War.
Growth didn't turn negative, but it slowed down dramatically. Fell from over 5% the previous year to just 1.6%, a significant slowdown.
But Kargil in 99, that was different again, wasn't it? Didn't GDP growth actually increase?
It did. That's the outlier. Growth went from 6.2% in 98 to 8.9% in 99, right, during the conflict. It really shows how complex these things are, not always a straightforward negative impact.
So, historically, a noticeable hit to GDP seems more common than a big hit to the stock market. But the report makes a point about today's economy, right?
A very important point. The Indian economy today is vastly different from what it was during those earlier wars. It's much, much larger, more diversified, more resilient,
Using.
meaning that simply taking those historical GDP percentage impacts and applying them directly to today might be misleading. The economy now might absorb such shocks differently, perhaps with less severe consequences than in, say, 1965 or 1971.
Right. So we're seeing this current conflict heat up. The initial market reaction seems to fit the historical pattern, not much panic.
So far, yeah.
But given everything we've discussed, the potential for this to be longer, wider, plus today's interconnected global economy, could the outcome be different this time, both for the market and for GDP?
It's definitely the question everyone's asking. That interconnectedness is key. Global supply chains, energy prices, investor sentiment worldwide, all these things could react differently now.
But that resilience factor you mentioned, that's still there.
It is. The underlying strength of the Indian economy is a buffer that didn't exist to the same extent decades ago. So it's this complex interplay. History gives us clues, but the current context is unique. The long-term economic impact is still very much an open question.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up the key points from this deep dive. We've seen India adopt a much more assertive military stance with Operation Sindoor, a clear shift.
A potential paradigm shift in response to cross-border terrorism, yes.
This led to a rapid and worrying escalation with Pakistan, involving pretty sophisticated weapons on both sides. The risk of a longer, broader conflict feels higher than it has in years.
Definitely. The situation remains volatile.
Looking back, historically, the Indian stock market has been surprisingly resilient during these conflicts. Limited downside, mostly.
Counterintuitively resilient, yes.
But the impact on actual GDP growth has been more noticeable in the past, though maybe less so now because the economy itself is much stronger, more resilient than it used to be.
Exactly. The scale and structure of the economy have changed fundamentally.
So it really highlights this fascinating tension between the immediate, very real geopolitical dangers and the potential longer-term economic effects, which are harder to predict now.
The past provides a guide, but not necessarily a map for the future in this case.
Right. So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. We see India has changed its security approach. We know its economy is much more robust now. So how might future conflicts like this one with Pakistan, or potentially other similar crises, actually play out differently, not just geopolitically, but economically? How different might the consequences be compared to what history tells us? It really makes you think about how these regional dynamics are evolving and what that means for the future.